Thousands of documents from 2 criminal investigations into the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein have been released in the US. Among the files are details of Epstein's contacts book, which offers a glimpse into the sheer number of his wealthy and powerful associates. Today is the legal deadline for the Justice Department to make the information public, although the Deputy Attorney General said earlier that not everything will be released in time to meet that deadline. Let's go straight to our correspondent, Tom Bateman, who is in Washington tonight. The scale of this release, Tom, is huge. What are we learning so far?
Well, this is a case, Jane, remember, that has convulsed the political system here in Washington. And the release of these files have been demanded by Congress, who in the end forced the hand of President Trump to create this legal deadline today.
Hello and welcome, guys. Adam is here. So what is happening right now? Every thread of the accountability narrative has now converged into one concrete reality. The Epstein files, real, indexed, cataloged documents legally required to be released but never have been. Deutsche Bank records, already handed over, painting a far more damning picture of Trump's finances than any public reporting has captured.
CNN learned late today that Deutsche Bank, a bank that did millions of dollars of business with Donald Trump over the years, has begun providing financial records to the New York State Attorney General's office. The bank's cooperation is in response to subpoenas issued for the documents, and those records are part of what President Trump has said he considers his red line. David, how significant is it that Deutsche Bank is handing over these documents? I mean, and also, do we know, is this the full, is this all the documents they have, or is it just some documents?
Well, first of all, it is significant. This is the first step in what's going to be a long process, not just with the New York Attorney General, but also with congressional investigators who are really prying into everything they can about Deutsche Bank and its relationship with Donald Trump.
The Civil Fraud Monitor, not a future safeguard, an active, present tense mechanism sitting inside the Trump organization right now, reporting back to the court in real time. The Bedminster recording, Trump's own voice, dismantling his own defenses.
And now back to our top story. CBS News has obtained a newly released audio recording that could be a key piece of evidence in the federal government's case against Donald Trump. In it, we can hear the former president discussing secret documents at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey. So Catherine Herridge is in Washington with more on this. Catherine, good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. In the 2-minute audio recording, the former president denounces his former top military advisor, General Mark Milley, and appears to share what he describes as highly confidential and secret information involving a Defense Department plan of attack on Iran. And in the indictment, he's accused of showing the records to a small group, apparently with no security clearance.
He said he wanted to attack Iran and what? These are the papers. This was done by the military and given to me.
These aren't theories. They're active, ongoing investigations quietly accumulating evidence. And what they're building toward is the single most important open question in American political life right now. Yeah. When hidden documents finally surface in this kind of environment, they do not arrive as isolated curiosities. They do not land gently like a single snowflake on a winter morning. They arrive in a context where the documentary record has already been partially constructed, where the scaffolding of the case is already in place, and where each new piece of evidence has the terrifying potential to complete the picture in a way that transforms the accumulated weight of the evidence from merely damaging to absolutely decisive.
Donald Trump knew Epstein for years, but says he kicked him out of his club in the early 2000s for being a creep. The call to release the files has convulsed his party, but earlier this year, the president was resisting.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. You're asking, we have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep?
Standing with victims, lawmakers have long called for the files' release, Congress finally forcing the president's hand. But still, a top Republican on the committee that helped push it is warning of consequences if the administration doesn't release nearly everything.
Stay with me, because this is where the abstract becomes the concrete. Let's talk about the numbers first, because the numbers are where the specific, undeniable truth of this situation lives. Approximately 3 to 3.5 million pages of Epstein-related documents have been released to the public. That sounds like a massive number, and it is. But here is the part that should make your stomach drop. Somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pages are still missing, still hidden, still locked away.
Breaking tonight, the Justice Department releasing more than 3 million pages of documents related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. President Trump's name referenced hundreds of times. But what the Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche is saying tonight about the president and Jeffrey Epstein. Here's Pierre Thomas.
Tonight, the Justice Department releasing more than 3 million pages of documents from the FBI's investigation into sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche declaring they have now fully complied with the law.
Today's release marks the end of a very comprehensive document identification and review process to ensure transparency to the American people.
In a letter to Congress, Blanche and Attorney General Pam Bondi acknowledged approximately 200,000 pages have been redacted or withheld based on various privileges. DOJ says they're withholding nearly 3 million other documents for various reasons, including victim privacy, because they contained images of child sexual abuse.
And we know this not because of a conspiracy theory or a leak from a disgruntled staffer. We know this because the government's own internal indices, the very catalogs that the National Archives and the Department of Justice use to track what they have and what they don't, confirm that specific documents exist which are not present in the public database. Investigative journalists at NPR and the BBC have conducted exhaustive analyses of these records, and they have confirmed a specific, alarming pattern. Documents that involve Trump-related allegations, documents that the internal indices explicitly list as existing, are not in the batch of materials that the administration has claimed represents full transparency. That gap, that specific and meticulously documented chasm of 2.5 to 3 million pages between what the government's own records confirm exists and what has actually been released to the American people, is the most precisely quantified and the most specifically documented evidence gap in the current accountability landscape. Come on. This is not some vague, hand-waving allegation about hidden documents. This is a specific, numerical, documented gap. It is a void that has been measured and confirmed by the very agencies that are supposed to be the custodians of the public trust. And the specific question of what is contained within those 2.5 to 3 million missing pages is the most important open evidentiary question in the entire Epstein accountability story. The Civil Fraud Monitor reports represent the second major category of potentially decisive documentary evidence, and they deserve to be treated with the gravity they warrant because they represent the real-time, ongoing surveillance mechanism that is most directly positioned to produce the kind of hidden document disclosure that turns a political scandal into a legal catastrophe. Judge Engeron, in the wake of the massive civil fraud judgment against the Trump Organization, appointed an independent monitor. This monitor has the specific, court-ordered authority to review financial transactions, to scrutinize business decisions, and to report directly back to the court on any conduct that raises concerns about the integrity of the assets that are supposed to be available to satisfy the judgment. Those reports exist. They are being written. They are being filed. They may or may not be public right now, depending on whether the court has ordered their disclosure in the context of specific enforcement proceedings. But the specific content of those reports, what the monitor has actually found when reviewing the Trump Organization's financial conduct in real time with full, unfettered access to the internal books, is potentially the most immediately consequential documentary evidence that could surface in any enforcement or accountability proceeding related to the civil fraud judgment. Yeah. The monitor is there. The monitor is watching. The monitor has a key to the financial filing cabinet, and the possibility that the monitor's reports contain specific findings that the court will eventually require to be disclosed in the context of enforcement proceedings is the most immediately grounded version of the hidden document surface scenario available in the current documented reality. The bank records from the Deutsche Bank subpoena are the third pillar of this evidentiary tripod. These records represent the most comprehensive and most specifically detailed financial history of the Trump borrowing and repayment cycle that any outside party has ever been allowed to examine. We know, as a matter of public record, that Deutsche Bank turned over extensive Trump financial records to New York prosecutors under the force of a grand jury subpoena. We know those records include the full, unvarnished history of the lending relationship stretching back years. We know they include the internal communications between bank officers about the risk profile of the Trump relationship. We know they include the compliance concerns that were documented, flagged, and potentially ignored within the institution's own risk management systems. What we do not know is the full, specific content of what those records reveal beyond the broad, generalized outlines that have been reported in the press. The specific internal Deutsche Bank communications about the Trump accounts, the granular transaction records, the specific compliance flagging that occurred when loans were being underwritten and renewed, all of that is sitting in the hands of investigators who have been meticulously building the financial fraud case of which the civil fraud judgment was just one expression. Are you kidding me? The records exist. They are not lost. They are not destroyed. They are in the possession of law enforcement. And the specific question of what those detailed internal records show about the financial conduct that was most carefully managed and most specifically structured during the lending relationship is the most important open evidentiary question in the financial accountability story. The classified documents case, and specifically the Bedminster recording, provides the fourth category of evidence that establishes the most direct and most devastating precedent for what happens when hidden documentary evidence about what Trump knew, and when he knew, it surfaces in a legal proceeding. The Bedminster tape did not just add a minor piece of corroboration to the case. It detonated the primary defense. For months, Trump and his allies had been telling the public that the classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago were not really classified, that he had a standing order to declassify anything he took, that it was all a big misunderstanding. And then the tape dropped. And on that tape, in his own voice, in an unguarded private setting, Donald Trump was heard discussing a specific classified military document and acknowledging that it was still classified and that he could not show it to the people in the room. That specific precedent, evidence of private knowledge directly and specifically contradicting a public denial, is the most precisely relevant framework for understanding why any additional documentary evidence showing Trump was briefed on specific matters he later claimed ignorance of would be so immediately and so totally devastating. Yeah. The Bedminster tape established the pattern. Any additional documentation showing Trump was briefed on specific matters, signed off on specific decisions, or personally directed specific actions that he later publicly denied knowledge of fits that exact same pattern and produces the exact same defense implosion dynamic. All right, so let us really get deep into the full architecture of this situation, because there are three specific dimensions of the hidden documents implode story that each demand careful and detailed treatment. The first dimension is the specific documentary evidence gaps that are most precisely quantified and most specifically documented in the current accountability landscape, and why those gaps represent the most realistically grounded version of this scenario. The second dimension is the legal analysis of how new documentary evidence that contradicts prior sworn testimony or prior public denials produces the defense implosion dynamic. And the third dimension is the specific removal demand mechanisms and the question of which constitutional tool is most appropriately calibrated to the specific character of the documentary evidence and the specific nature of the conduct it documents. Let's start with the documentary evidence gaps. The Epstein files gap is the most precisely quantified example available anywhere in this sprawling saga. 2.5 to 3 million pages. That number is not pulled from thin air. It is derived from the government's own internal tracking systems. These are pages that are confirmed by credible investigative reporting to include documents specifically connected to Trump-related allegations. That is a specific numerical and documentary gap whose existence is confirmed by the government's own records. The Civil Fraud Monitor reports are the most real-time and operationally immediate evidence gap. Those reports exist right now. They are current. They reflect the Monitor's direct access to the most sensitive internal financial records. And the question of what they contain and when their contents will become public is the most actionable open question in the financial accountability landscape. The evidence gaps are real, they are specific, they are quantified, and the hidden document surface scenario is simply the realistic description of what happens when the enforcement proceedings require the disclosure of the material that those gaps contain. The obstruction of justice dimension of a hidden document surface scenario is worth examining with a magnifying glass. The failure to produce documents in response to specific subpoenas or specific legal disclosure obligations is not just a procedural foul, it is itself a specific and serious crime that compounds the original conduct the documents were meant to reveal. When documents that were subject to specific subpoenas or specific statutory disclosure obligations are later found to have been withheld, the act of withholding is itself obstruction of justice. It is a crime independent of whatever the withheld documents show about the underlying conduct. Congressional investigators or prosecutors who discover that documents they specifically requested were not produced when they were legally required to be produced have two independent bases for legal action: the documented underlying conduct and the documented obstruction of the investigation of that conduct. The comparison between what was produced and what the internal records confirm existed is the most specifically actionable version of the hidden document scenario because it establishes both the substantive conduct and the cover-up simultaneously. The signed document dimension deserves its own careful analysis because documents bearing Trump's own signature or handwritten notes are the category of documentary evidence that most specifically and most directly establishes personal knowledge and personal authorization. The ignorance defense is the most consistently deployed shield across multiple different proceedings. It works by arguing that the specific conduct at issue happened below the level of Trump's personal involvement, that he was not briefed, did not authorize, and did not have specific knowledge of the decisions that are alleged to have been improper. That defense collapses instantly and totally when a document bearing Trump's signature or his handwritten note surfaces. A signed document is the most direct available refutation of the ignorance defense. It does not require a witness to testify about what Trump was told. It does not require a jury to draw an inference about what a briefed president would have known. It says directly and specifically on its face that the person whose signature appears on it was personally involved with the specific content of the document. Come on. The defense implosion precedent is established by the Bedminster tape. The same dynamic applied to other documentary evidence categories produces the same result. And the specific evidence that establishes personal knowledge of conduct that was publicly denied is the most precisely devastating version of the defense implosion available. The distinction between the 25th Amendment and impeachment is worth treating carefully. The two mechanisms are calibrated to different specific types of conduct, and the specific character of the documentary evidence most directly determines which mechanism is most appropriately responsive. The 25th Amendment addresses the president's ability to discharge the powers and duties of the office. It is calibrated to situations of incapacitation. Impeachment addresses high crimes and misdemeanors. It is calibrated to situations of deliberate abuse of power, obstruction of accountability, and violation of specific legal obligations. Hidden documents that establish deliberate suppression of legally required disclosures, personal authorization of conduct that was publicly denied, and deliberate withholding of material subject to specific congressional subpoenas most directly support the impeachment framework because they document deliberate, intentional conduct rather than incapacity. Yeah. The specific character of the documentary evidence determines the most appropriate constitutional mechanism. The fast-track impeachment mechanism is worth understanding in its specific procedural character. Fast-track impeachment is not constitutionally impossible. It is procedurally challenging but specifically available when the House leadership determines that the urgency of the conduct warrants expedition of the normal committee deliberation process. The second Trump impeachment after January 6th was processed in approximately 1 week from the event to the House vote. That precedent establishes that impeachment can move on a compressed timeline when the urgency requires it. The specific evidentiary quality of the documents at issue determines whether that urgency argument is most specifically supported. Documents with Trump's own signature or handwritten notes directly connecting him to conduct he publicly denied, bearing on ongoing legal proceedings and ongoing obstruction, are the specific category of evidence that most directly supports the urgency argument for fast-track impeachment because they show not just past misconduct, but ongoing active conduct that continues to harm the accountability proceedings every day. It continues. Are you kidding me? Ongoing active obstruction supported by specific documentary evidence is the most specifically compelling urgency argument for fast-track impeachment available in the current accountability landscape. All right, let us bring this all the way home with 4 clear, concrete points. I want you to leave this with a complete understanding of the specific documented evidence gaps, how new documentary evidence produces the defense implosion dynamic, what the most appropriate constitutional removal mechanism is, and what we need to watch as this landscape continues to develop. Point 1. The specific documented evidence gaps in the Epstein files, the Civil Fraud Monitor reports, and the Deutsche Bank subpoena records are the most precisely quantified and most specifically grounded versions of the hidden document surface scenario. The Epstein files gap is quantified at 2.5 to 3 million pages, whose existence is confirmed by internal government indices. The Civil Fraud Monitor reports are real-time ongoing surveillance documents. The Deutsche Bank records are comprehensive financial history documents in the hands of investigators. All 3 represent real documented evidence whose full content has not yet been made public and whose disclosure in specific accountability proceedings is the most realistically grounded version of this scenario. New documentary evidence establishing personal knowledge, personal authorization, or personal direction of conduct that was publicly denied produces the defense implosion dynamic through the most direct available contradiction of the ignorance and delegation defenses. A signed document directly contradicts the ignorance defense without requiring any witness testimony or inference. Documents bearing personal handwritten notes are even more specifically devastating. The Bedminster tape precedent establishes specifically that this defense implosion dynamic is real and available in the Trump accountability context. The defense implosion precedent is established. The same dynamic applied to other documentary evidence categories produces the same result. The impeachment framework is the most specifically appropriate constitutional removal mechanism for the documentary evidence the hidden document scenario most directly supports. Impeachment addresses high crimes and misdemeanors, which most specifically covers deliberate deception and deliberate obstruction. Documents establishing deliberate suppression of legally required disclosures, personal authorization of publicly denied conduct, and deliberate withholding of material subject to specific congressional subpoenas most directly satisfy the high crimes and misdemeanor standard. The fast-track impeachment precedent from the second Trump impeachment establishes that the process can move on a compressed timeline when the House leadership determines the urgency requires it. Here is exactly what we need to watch as the documentary evidence landscape continues to develop. Watch the Epstein files release proceedings for any indication that the court or congressional oversight is forcing disclosure of the specific document categories that the internal indices confirm exist. Watch the Civil Fraud Monitor proceedings for any indication that the monitor has made findings that the court is requiring to be disclosed. Watch the Deutsche Bank records litigation for any indication that specific categories of the internal financial communications are being compelled to be produced. And watch the classified documents case proceedings for any indication that additional documentary evidence beyond the Bedminster recording is being admitted. So here is the absolute bottom line. The specific documented evidence gaps in the Epstein files, the Civil Fraud Monitor reports, and the Deutsche Bank subpoena records are the most precisely quantified and most specifically grounded versions of the hidden document surface scenario. New documentary evidence establishing personal knowledge or personal authorization of publicly denied conduct produces the defense implosion dynamic through the most direct available contradiction of the ignorance and delegation defenses. The impeachment framework is the most specifically appropriate constitutional removal mechanism. The fast-track impeachment precedent establishes that the process can move on the compressed timeline the instant removal framing implies, and the convergence of multiple documentary evidence streams all building toward the same accountability destination, the Epstein files, the financial records, the classified documents case, the civil fraud monitor, is the most specific available version of the accumulated evidentiary pressure that the hidden documents implode characterization most dramatically captures. Come on, the evidence exists, the gaps are documented, the disclosure mechanisms are in place, and the documentary evidence that surfaces through those mechanisms has the potential to produce the most consequential shift in the entire second-term accountability landscape. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Does the hidden documentary evidence surface through the specific enforcement and oversight proceedings most directly authorized to compel its disclosure? Or does the obstruction pattern successfully delay the most consequential disclosures past the point where they can produce the most immediate accountability consequences? I want to hear from you. I'll see you in the next one.